The
Are you
notice didn't look
serious?
serious at first. It was just another envelope taped
My
neatly
lawn
to the
is
front door,
perfect.
stamped with the familiar HOA logo that most homeowners learn to ignore unless absolutely necessary. The neighborhood had a rhythm to it, quiet, controlled, predictable. Lawns trimmed to uniform height, paint colors restricted to a narrow palette, and rules that most people followed without question. I had lived there long enough to understand how things worked. Compliance meant peace. Questions meant attention. Still, I opened the envelope casually, expecting something minor, maybe a reminder about trash bins or a seasonal guideline update. Instead, I found a violation notice demanding immediate removal of an unauthorized structure and payment of a $1,000 fine. The structure in question was a small backyard shed. It wasn't large. It wasn't visible from the street. It wasn't even permanent. It sat neatly behind my fence, tucked into the corner of the yard, used for storing gardening tools and seasonal equipment. It matched the color of the house, followed standard size limits, and had been installed months earlier without a single complaint. Until now. The letter cited a failure to obtain prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. It referenced a clause buried deep in the HOA bylaws requiring written permission before adding any external structure, no matter how small. That alone wasn't unusual. HOAs often required approvals. What made it strange was the timing. For months, no one had mentioned it. No warnings. No informal notices. No neighbor complaints. Just silence, until a sudden $1,000 fine appeared without warning. Standing in the backyard, looking at the shed, it was difficult to understand how something so small could suddenly become such a big issue. But the more I thought about it, the more familiar the pattern felt. The HOA board had a reputation. It wasn't openly discussed, but it was understood. Enforcement wasn't always consistent. Some homeowners seemed to receive notices for minor issues, while others made far more noticeable changes without consequence. Selective enforcement was never written into the rules. But it existed in practice. The shed had become a target. And I had a feeling I knew why. A few weeks earlier, I had attended an HOA meeting where the board discussed increasing monthly dues. The justification was vague: rising maintenance costs, community improvements, reserve funding. The numbers were presented in summary form, without detailed breakdowns. I had asked for clarification. Nothing aggressive. Nothing confrontational. Just a request for transparency. The room had gone quiet for a moment longer than expected. The board moved on quickly. But something about that moment lingered. Now, holding the violation notice, the connection felt less like coincidence. I walked the neighborhood later that evening, something I hadn't done with intention before. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Uniform homes, carefully maintained exteriors, a sense of order that gave the impression of stability. But once I started paying attention, small inconsistencies began to stand out. A neighbor down the street had a large, permanent storage unit visible from the side yard, much bigger than my shed. Another home had recently added a pergola structure that extended well beyond typical guidelines. One house had installed a second detached unit in their backyard that clearly required approval. None of them had violation notices taped to their doors. At least, not that I could see. The pattern wasn't obvious at first glance. But it was there. Back at home, I reread the notice carefully. The language was formal, but the lack of prior warning stood out. The immediate jump to a $1,000 fine suggested urgency, or intention. This wasn't about giving me a chance to correct a mistake. It was about enforcing a penalty. The question was why. Instead of reacting immediately, I pulled out the HOA governing documents I had barely touched since moving in. Page after page outlined restrictions, procedures, and approval requirements. The clause about external structures was there, just as the notice claimed. But so were dozens of other rules. Rules about fence height. Rules about exterior modifications. Rules about visible storage units. Rules about landscaping structures. Rules that, based on what I had seen that evening, were not being enforced equally. The more I read, the clearer it became. The issue wasn't the shed. It was consistency. If the rules applied to everyone, then everyone should be held to the same standard. If they didn't, then the system itself wasn't functioning as intended. I stepped outside one last time before heading in for the night. The shed sat quietly in the corner, unchanged, harmless, and suddenly at the center of something much larger than itself. The fine was significant. But it wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the pattern behind it. And for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I realized something important. This wasn't going to be resolved by simply paying the fine or removing the shed. Because once selective enforcement begins, it rarely stops at one issue. It grows. Unless someone challenges it. The second notice arrived faster than expected. This time, it included an additional late fee and a warning of further penalties if the structure was not removed immediately. The tone had shifted from formal to firm, as if the situation had already been decided and my role was simply to comply. But something about the escalation felt premature. There had been no follow-up inspection. No communication requesting clarification. No opportunity to submit a retroactive approval request. Just enforcement. That lack of process stood out more than the fine itself. I began to look beyond my own situation. The neighborhood had always appeared stable, but stability can hide underlying tension when rules are applied unevenly. Conversations with neighbors revealed something that had been quietly building for years, frustration that never quite reached the surface. Some had received fines for minor issues. Others had made significant changes without consequence. There was no clear pattern except one. The board rarely enforced rules against itself. That realization shifted everything. Once the pattern became visible, it was impossible to ignore. What had started as a personal frustration over a $1,000 fine slowly turned into something heavier, something shared. The neighborhood, once quiet and predictable, began to feel different. Not chaotic, not hostile, but aware. Awareness changes everything. At first, the conversations were subtle. Short exchanges during evening walks. Quick remarks near mailboxes. Careful observations shared without drawing too much attention. No one wanted to be the center of conflict, but many had their own stories. A retired homeowner described being fined for a minor landscaping issue while a board member's yard featured unapproved decorative structures. A young couple mentioned being warned about exterior paint tones, even though several homes nearby clearly deviated from the approved palette. Another resident spoke about installing a small patio extension that triggered multiple notices, while larger modifications across the street remained untouched. Each story followed the same quiet pattern. Rules existed. Enforcement varied. And those who questioned decisions often found themselves under increased scrutiny. The emotional weight of that realization began to build. This wasn't just about documentation anymore. It was about trust, something the community had slowly lost without fully realizing it. People had adapted to the system rather than engaging with it. They followed rules not because they believed in them, but because challenging them seemed exhausting. That unspoken fatigue had allowed inconsistency to grow. Standing in the backyard one evening, looking at the shed that had started it all, it no longer felt like the center of the issue. It felt like a symbol, small, ordinary, but suddenly meaningful. It represented a line. Not a dramatic one. Not a confrontational one. But a line between passive acceptance and quiet resistance. The more I organized documentation, photos, dates, notes, the more others began to contribute. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. Evidence appeared in small pieces. A picture of a large unapproved pergola. A timestamp showing a long-standing structure that had never been cited. Copies of old notices that revealed inconsistent enforcement. The information didn't need to be exaggerated. It spoke for itself. Emotionally, something shifted within me as well. The frustration I had initially felt began to settle into clarity. This wasn't about winning a dispute. It was about understanding the system well enough to challenge it effectively. Anger would have been easy. Precision required patience. The HOA board continued sending notices, each one reinforcing their position. The fines accumulated, creating pressure. But the pressure no longer felt isolating. It felt expected. Predictable. Because once patterns are recognized, actions become easier to anticipate. The neighborhood itself began to reflect the tension in subtle ways. Meetings saw slightly higher attendance. Emails from the board became more carefully worded. Small details that once went unnoticed started to attract attention. The system wasn't collapsing. It was being observed. And observation alone can be powerful. One evening, as the sun lowered behind identical rooftops, the neighborhood looked as calm as it always had. Lawns were trimmed. Lights flickered on. Cars lined driveways in neat symmetry. But beneath that calm surface, something had changed. People were paying attention. And once attention spreads, silence begins to fade. The shed remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, quiet, unchanged, and unexpectedly significant. The next HOA meeting marked a turning point. Attendance had doubled, maybe tripled. What was usually a small gathering of familiar faces had become a full room of residents who rarely showed up before. The shift wasn't loud or chaotic, it was focused. Intentional. The board maintained its usual structure, presenting updates and addressing routine matters. But the atmosphere had changed. The sense of passive agreement that once defined these meetings had been replaced with something more deliberate. Questions. Not emotional outbursts. Not confrontations. Just clear, specific questions. Requests for enforcement logs. Clarification on approval processes. Explanations for inconsistent citations. Inquiries about structures that appeared to violate the same rules but had never been addressed. The responses were controlled, but less certain than before. For the first time, the board was being asked to explain patterns rather than isolated decisions. That shift mattered. After the meeting, the pressure increased. Another notice arrived, this time referencing potential legal action if the fines remained unpaid. The language suggested escalation beyond internal enforcement, something designed to push the situation toward resolution through compliance. But by then, the situation had already moved beyond a simple dispute. The documentation had grown too extensive. The pattern too clear. Instead of responding privately, I organized everything into a structured timeline, every notice, every photo, every comparison. Not for confrontation, but for clarity. Clarity has its own power. When information is organized, it becomes difficult to dismiss. The tension reached its peak when the situation moved beyond the neighborhood itself. What had been contained within HOA emails and meetings began to attract outside attention. Not through dramatic exposure, but through structured presentation of facts. And facts, once visible, changed perception. The board could no longer rely on ambiguity. Every decision now existed within a larger context. Every action could be compared. The balance had shifted. The breakthrough didn't come from confrontation. It came from records. During the process of organizing documentation, a deeper pattern began to emerge, one that extended beyond inconsistent enforcement into something more structural. Board members themselves were in violation of the same rules they were enforcing. It wasn't obvious at first. Each case seemed minor when viewed individually. A slightly oversized structure. An unapproved exterior addition. A modification that should have required review. But collectively, the pattern was undeniable. Multiple board members had made changes to their properties without documented approval. And none of those changes had resulted in fines. The realization shifted the entire narrative. This wasn't selective enforcement driven by oversight. It was selective enforcement driven by position. The rules existed, but they were not being applied equally. When this information was compiled and presented, the response was immediate, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. The board could no longer maintain the appearance of consistency. Because the evidence wasn't based on interpretation. It was based on comparison. The same rules. The same violations. Different outcomes. That contrast spoke louder than any argument. The situation no longer revolved around my shed. It revolved around the credibility of the system itself. The resolution came quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no public acknowledgement of fault. Instead, the changes appeared through process. The fines were withdrawn. The violation notice was reclassified. A review of enforcement procedures was announced, framed as an effort to improve consistency and clarity. Board members stepped back from visible enforcement roles. New guidelines were introduced requiring documented approval records and standardized citation processes. The system adjusted. Not because it was forced to publicly admit failure, but because it could no longer sustain inconsistency under scrutiny. The shed remained. Unchanged from the day it was built. But its significance had evolved. It was no longer just a structure. It was a reminder that systems, no matter how small or localized, depend on fairness to function effectively. The neighborhood slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Lawns remained trimmed. Rules still existed. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Awareness. Homeowners paid closer attention. Meetings saw steady participation. Documentation became part of the process rather than an afterthought. Trust, once weakened, began to rebuild, not through promises, but through consistency. Looking back, the most important realization wasn't about winning a dispute. It was about understanding how easily systems drift when left unquestioned. Rules are not the problem. Selective application is. And accountability doesn't require conflict. It requires clarity. The shed stood quietly in the corner of the yard, just as it always had. But the neighborhood around it had changed. And that change was enough.